The exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios Base Capsule. I have no idea what's going on this week, but I know it's pretty serious because the internet's kind of pissed off. Also, Linux is not ready for aerospace. Well, that was random. Exceptional radio.
Say Linux.
Yeah, Linux. There's like the Linux consortium is trying to butt their way into aerospace because they think they can develop, software for aircraft and spacecraft and satellites better than the established community that's like built security into, the very framework of operating system development, real-time operating system development. Also, let's be really frank here. Linux is not a real-time operating system. It's a monolithic kernel operating system designed for, multitasking, and it can be highly specialized, but it's not a real-time operating system. It never has been, it never will be. It's really good at some things, like some heavy lifting, like serving websites and databases and doing like data analysis type stuff. But man, the idea of anybody just writing a driver that has kernel access that could control an aircraft, that just blows my mind.
Yeah, it's very scary.
I mean, and this is not a slight against the culture of Linux, because I love Linux. I love open source software, but it's just the nature of the culture itself. It wants to tinker, it wants to hack, it wants to improve things, and these are all admirable goals, but not when, people's lives are on the line in aircraft above us that could fall and land on somebody's house. So I was reading about this stuff, and it was one of those moments where it's like, are these people serious? Do they really think that they're gonna just force their way into freaking aerospace? Like NASA, they really screen all of their candidates for any role, especially if they're going to be involved in any kind of software programming. I feel very confident saying they're not using just Debian or SUSE or something like that. They're using a very, very customized operating system designed around specific hardware. I mean, it's like as Unix as it gets. Also, the idea of open source software to control airplanes just, I think that's why there's so many issues getting flight sticks to work with flying games. At a point, like even the hardware developers can't keep up with the software developers.
Yeah, I'm not sure what provoked that attempted move, but yeah, it doesn't seem like I wonder with these tech bros sometimes.
Yeah. Like what's the actual goal here? To destabilize the aerospace industry? Because that's what tech bros seem to be really good at doing, is destabilizing shit. I mean, I guess on some level that's like super rebel, iconoclast type stuff, and it resonates with me on some weird level, like some teenage destroy the establishment, let's wreck the place kind of attitude. But I'm definitely not a teenager anymore, and I don't have those ideas. No, and I think those ideas are strange now. Now that I think about it, it's like, man, what the hell was I thinking?
Well, and even, I know disruption was the big thing in the tech bro space for a few years, but it's like everything doesn't need to be disrupted. And I think they might have taken some of those things too far in some spaces where it's like, yeah, the aerospace industry does not need disruption. It needs progression. Constant progression is not the same as having someone come in and disrupt things. I'm not sure that the tech bro space has really.
I mean, we just saw like the other day what happens when people try to disrupt the certification process and take
Yeah,
a tin can down to the bottom of the ocean. Like that guy was a disruptor. He wasn't an innovator.
right. Because then you get the, Richard Branson's now he's like coming under fire for his space commercial space venture because before it was like, oh, he's innovating. And now I think people are finally starting to wake up to that um reality that it's like just because somebody's rich and doing something doesn't mean it's necessarily good. And especially like now that Elon has officially broken Twitter again. Um
I wasn't sure that I read it correctly last night when I read that people were getting essentially being denied access to their accounts.
so here's what happened, and I read a few of the breakdowns on what happened. Um, there's a few bills that Elon's not paying, and then one of them was the Google. Uh, I think it's like I think they were using Google Drive or some sort of like Google servers to store the calls for when APIs are like requesting search like queries from Twitter. So in the process of him not paying that bill, he decided in his infinite wisdom to cut off all the APIs that were doing the search requests, or by not paying that bill, it cut those off. So then it the API anytime anyone links something to Twitter, all of those links got broken, and because of the way that the infrastructure set up, instead of those things just not working, every single link is constantly trying to request to reload. And in that process, it does 20 requests per second. So
Oh man.
every time someone has linked to a Twitter post, it now becomes a broken link that's requesting Twitter 20 times per second and effectively denial of servicing
He created
itself.
his own DDoS.
Yeah.
So I saw this tweet of his. It said verified accounts are limited to 6,000 posts per day. Unverified accounts 600.
600, not even 6,000.
No, that was the verified accounts were limited to 6,000.
Oh,
Unverified accounts limited to 600 posts per day, and new unverified accounts to 300. And this was raised later that day to 8,000 for verified, 800 for unverified, and 400 for new unverified. So I'm not. I'm pretty sure that if I just scan through Twitter, just aimlessly, I'm gonna see 100 posts in a matter of minutes, easily. Like what the? That's not just broken. That's like come back for uh, your picture of the day type shit. This is like even worse than you can only look at, um, you know, you've reached your free article limit for the paywall news sites, which is kind of absurd that those things even exist still. But this is even weirder because he didn't pay his bill.
effectively. Yeah. And in the process, it's like
Isn't he supposed to be like the richest man on earth or some shit?
he's it's not the only one he hasn't paid. There's a few like I think at one point he hadn't paid the rent on the place. The rent was overdue on the headquarters. I think they lost a few of the floors. There's like a whole lot of things uh, lost because of him not paying bills, and that's why he's like effectively trying to see what the lowest functioning Twitter can be by just cutting things what seems to be randomly, and then if it breaks, he turns them back on, which is like doing that on the public stage is that's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it works out for him.
Oh
Because
man,
I mean,
can you imagine if Ford or GM decided to test their products like that?
isn't that called the Gremlin?
Oh yeah. I think.
When it was like
I mean,
exploding
isn't this
randomly.
the exact reason why open source can't be like just force its way into the aerospace industry? This is like precisely the reason that these things don't happen. Because all it takes is one idiot who decides, "Oh, I'm going to turn this off to see what happens," like without fully understanding why the system exists in the first place. Oh, this reminds me of like finding like what looks like an ancient batch file on an FTP server and not knowing what it does, but not touching it because I didn't put it there and it's not mine. And then when the contents of said FTP drive are migrated to new physical hardware, but for whatever reason that batch file is not relinked because who knows why. And then all of a sudden the FTP server like stops working and somebody has to go tunnel in and nobody remembers nobody remembers what was going on because it was done as like a band-aid in years past, but probably by a different systems administrator. This is the kind of like a ghost in the machine level thing, except he's like you said he's doing it right out in front. Just let's turn this off and see what happens.
On a public stage he overpaid for, massively
Oh
overpaid.
man.
Which you know, for I think what was it, there was like an Indian billionaire that overtook him at one point, and then I think he took back over on the paper wealthiest person in the world. But it's like this they must have reached the peak of what those people can make in terms of like as an individual who's hoarding wealth, because his has started to recede, and that's where I'm like they just must have hit the ceiling on in terms of like a point of diminishing returns. Once you have so much money, your decision making makes it impossible to keep accumulating money because you can't keep winning.
Man, what a solid twist on chaos theory. Oh, and game theory at the same time. This is like the most chaotic game theory ever. You can only make so much money up until a point that you can't make money. I just don't get it. Is he trying to like? This is the weirdest way to identify the bot users on bot accounts on Twitter. Like make the ecosystem so horrible that all the real users just dip, and you're left with all of the if this then that automated accounts and all of the other weird bot accounts that just exist to put stuff onto Twitter. That's what he's going to be left with if this keeps up. Like who wants to hang out in a place where every other week there's some weird shit going on because the guy who's not even supposed to be at the helm anymore is making horrible decisions that affect the user base. That doesn't seem right. Like, I realize he owns the company and he doesn't really have to answer to anyone, but man, this is like egomaniacal social media manipulation at its I guess finest.
Elon Musk has lost a bigger fortune than anyone in history, apparently. His peak wealth was 340 billion, and now he's at um 230 or something after dropping to 142. But it's like it's so funny to see that type of fluctuation in terms of people's paper wealth. And at the same time, it's like clearly he's peaked.
Well,
And
he can't pump and dump Doge anymore. I mean, I guess he could, but only to
I
people who are
mean,
dumb enough to buy it.
right. But yeah, that's where I'm like his pump and dump schemes have run out, and it's like everything. Well, okay. Think about Neuralink in the wake of the Titan disaster. Neuralink was having um Neuralink was having problems before the Titan disaster, but now that people are more skeptical of rich people doing stupid things with money, it's like only the most committed Elon fanboys are going to go line up for that implant. And it's already gone, within the animal population that they were testing in and went horribly wrong. Like none of those tests were remotely successful. So that's where I'm like, that type of thing is basically dead on arrival now. And it sucks that it took the Titan disaster for people to start thinking critically about this type of stuff. Um, but I feel like it's like almost better that something like that happened to like five people before there was like thousands or potentially millions of people involved in something that goes horribly wrong at scale.
Yeah.
Which I feel like now the biggest scale that Neuralink is going to get is potentially even just uh like paraplegic um experimental, like there's going to be a ton of regulatory fallout from that Titan disaster. Um in this, in the same way the original Titanic kind of had that same effect. So I don't see it just being limited to submersibles,
I mean,
especially with the AI threat happening at the same time.
oh, what did I read? I can't remember who said it now. Anyways, somebody who important who knows a lot about AI, who knows more about it than I do, said that there's no assurance that a good AI would succeed over a bad AI. That we might not even be able to tell the difference between benevolent or malevolent AI. Like we just it's very likely that if one exists, the other also exists, and we don't know which is which or how to tell the difference. And that's actually terrifying because it knows everything. Like
That hold on. That benevolence and malevolence imply intention,
yeah,
which implies sentience, and we're not even remotely near. So that's like so cart before horse discussion in terms of like there's no indication that we're even remotely close to sentience. And when you talk to like the experts at the highest levels, they're like, yeah, it's still just parallel um like queries. I think what was it, eight times 200 trillion because it's eight in parallel. So there's like 200 trillion queries going on per second or something, but it's like eight in parallel doing that. So it's really the appearance of eight to the power of 200 trillion, but it's really
like 64.
right. It's actually
Jeffrey Hinton.
completely different than if it was the equivalent of the mathematic equation of that CPU alignment or processing um, array alignment in terms of like when you have parallel processing, it's not the same as a single processor, and there are benefits and drawbacks to it, but parallel processing can give the appearance of a singular processor when it's actually eight in parallel. And I think that's when we're seeing AI do these quick responses, it's because it has like 8 queries going to our one actual direct query. And it seems like it's one response when in fact it's like the accumulation of 8 different parallel. I mean, at least, and I think the most, what was it? The point of diminishing returns hit after like hits after 8 processors. So that's where it's like they're not going to use 16 processors because there's no actual benefit to keep continuing to add processors at a certain point. But
Well,
again,
I
that's
think
where
with
I'm
that
like,
point that with parallel processing architecture, it requires that more things actually need to happen. Like there actually
for
needs,
sure, for sure.
and if there
But
aren't,
what
if they're just it just keeps reiterating, then it's not actually doesn't actually need more lifting capability. It's just continuing
but what
to.
I'm getting at,
It's just I'm sorry. It's just being recursive. Sorry, please continue.
it still says the show is about to begin for the record.
Uh,
But ultimately, like something that's a bunch of parallel processing can, especially with lay people, you have a bunch of lay people looking at parallel processing, thinking that it's like close to Skynet sentience level when it's not even remotely close. So then you have the discussion of like benevolence versus malevolence when we're like, we haven't even hit sentience. So that's what I mean. Like, for them to be discussing benevolence versus malevolence, it's like, it's a not even the thought experiment has been going on for decades at this point, and we're slightly closer to sentience, but we're not remotely close to sentience in machines, which is why it's
like the version of AI that might emerge at some point, a sentient AI, if it ever emerges, might not be anything like what they're talking about. Is what you're getting at.
I mean, that's one of the aspects, but that discussion is just like, it's almost unnecessary because we're so far from it. It's like
Yeah,
discussing, should we put limits on the speed of light travel? Well, we haven't even fucking hit light travel if we can ever hit it. So
yeah,
like, why would we discuss speed limits on light travel? You know what I mean? And
yeah.
that's where it on the one hand, like I said, when you have like a bunch of like lay people who have seen the Terminator and they've seen the Terminator 2 and they also see Chat GPT, it looks scary to them and they're going to be scared of that because they can't tell the difference between extreme parallel processing and something that's getting close to sentience. Like they have no capacity to tell. And it's like that like in a Dunning-Kruger effect in terms of like, if you don't know what you don't know, you can convince yourself that you know a lot of things.
Oh
And
yeah,
then you have some people who are wholly convinced that, we're not going to know what benevolent or malevolent AI looks like. Well, we don't know what sentient AI looks like in the first place. So like, well, yeah, we clearly wouldn't know what either one looks like because we have no framing of actual sentient AI. And then when you have those dudes like the one that left Google and then was like trying to be a quote unquote whistleblower about um, the machines talking to each other, well, it was completely misrepresented. It's like, just because two things are like exchanging turns does not mean they're communicating with each other or that there's actually anything being understood. So for him, who's not a linguist, who's not familiar with like um, brain waves or anything
yeah, yeah.
in
No, no.
terms of
It's
like,
the that's the same guy as the Jeffrey Hinton, the artificial intelligence pioneer for quit Google, warns of the dangers of it.
yeah,
It's the same guy. Okay,
same guy.
that
Of
explains
course,
why.
it's the same
That
guy.
explains why that's why he frames it like that because that's his thing.
this guy should nobody should listen to this guy about anything because he speaks so far out of his expertise that it becomes borderline um delusion on the best case scenario and intentional misrepresentation in the worst. There's no good faith interpretation of what this guy's doing. And it's only to benefit himself in terms of like, if he was actually trying to whistleblow, he would be going to,
Congress?
um, no,
No.
Congress doesn't know fucking shit. He would be going to AI ethics, um, like conferences and AI ethics, uh, like journals and the places where AI ethics is actually being worked on because nobody
Yeah.
in the media knows fucking shit about AI ethics. Nobody in Congress knows fucking shit about AI
Nobody at the
ethics.
Washington Post.
Nobody at Washington Post. Nobody, so this is like knowing your audience versus knowing the people that can actually do something about what's being discussed. If his audience is the Washington Post, whether he knows it or not, his audience can't do shit and is not, in fact, educated enough to even discuss or have a discussion about the concepts that he's framing. So that's why I'm like, it happens in a lot of arenas in the United States because of free speech, quote unquote.
Free speech.
Test.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. But that type of thing happens in the US because people have free speech, which then to them translate the freedom to express any opinion about any subject, whether you know anything about it or not. And that's when you get the debate me bros who think that they can like give good reasons why you should fucking use Linux in aerospace. So it's like there's this huge breakdown of understanding of academic institutions and understanding of authority of information in terms of like if someone gets a degree in computer science, it's not because they paid for the degree. It's because they demonstrated the capacity to understand the concepts that were presented within that framework of that specific degree. Did it cost money? It happened to. It didn't used to always cost a ton of money, but now it happens to cost money where a lot of lay people who've never been in higher education equate the cost at the door with just paying for a degree and getting it rubber stamped, not as if there's no skill or knowledge that is acquired in the process. And the biggest problem is boomers don't value knowledge. So you have these people who came through this educational academic system and came out into an economy completely unvalued by the previous generation who effectively told them to do this because there were not enough manufacturing degrees to keep up with the population growth because they had outsourced them. And in the process, the socioeconomic ladders started to shift. So it's like people wanted to be seen in the middle and upper class, and that includes like going to college as a luxury and then coming out and doing white collar work as a luxury because you don't have to go work in the mines or work at a fucking factory like your grandfather because now you're educated and you can move up the socioeconomic ladder through education. So this was like what was pitched to people going to college, but it didn't play out because the people pitching it didn't actually care about the education. So it's like we're in this place now where we have a bunch of uh, boomers in positions of authority who never went to higher education. Then you have a bunch of Gen Xers and millennials who went through higher education and are not in positions of authority. And then you have Zoomers who are
who
looking at everybody.
who
And
wholesale
it's like,
reject everything.
because none of it
None of it makes
appears to have
sense.
worked.
Yeah.
Like from the Zoomer perspective, nothing has worked. So to them, like for us getting education and trying to work our way into the authority structure, that didn't work for us. And the boomer generation, them not getting education and trying to be fascist authority and trying to be top down managerial, well, that didn't work either. So you have these Zoomers who I think they're lying in wait or laying in wait to see what the next possible shift in socioeconomic structure can or should be. But it's not because they're dumb. I think it's just because they're disillusioned, but they also recognize that none of this shit before them worked.
I
Because
mean,
a lot of older people are out of touch and think that the Gen Z or Zoomers or whatever they're called aren't paying attention and don't know anything. But I think it's way different than that in terms of like, I think they're the most information rich generation that's ever lived, have the most access to information of any human generation ever in as far as we know in civilization. And you have these fucking boomers who have the gall to look down on them as if they're stupid or in any capacity. Like the dumbest fucking kid is smarter than the smartest boomer, which is fucking those boomers don't like that. They don't like that society gets better. In the wildest sense of irony, they hate it when things get better because they didn't get to experience it. Where I'm like, if a kid, I look at 13-year-old kids now, and some of them could go to college and learn the things that I was drip fed unnecessarily in a way that, to me, I didn't want to take summers off from school. I just wanted to get that shit fucking over with. I wanted to go like every summer as a kid. I'm like, why can't I just be fucking doing the next grade right now? No, you got to take the fucking summer off because this is fucking stupid. So I'm like looking at that as a kid. Well, now kids, it's very common for somebody to be able to finish college by 13 if they have the capacity. So I'm like looking at that. Good for them. I don't want them to have to suffer through the same fucking bullshit just to be 18 to get to senior year. That's fucking stupid. That's really fucking stupid because some kids are going to be able to do trigonometry when they're like 9. So why should fucking society not allow that kid to excel because the fucking teachers aren't paid enough to be able to accommodate that kid? Well, that's fucking dumb. And it's starting to change in a way that I can look at the kids now and be like, there are certain things that learning the social aspect of the education is good to take the time and like, you know, somebody who's 13 isn't necessarily going to be able to understand the complexities of social interactions when with 18 and 19-year-olds or 17 and 18-year-olds even. So I'm not saying they should be in non-educational scenarios with that same age group, but you can have a 13-year-old go in a fucking college classroom and be smarter than every motherfucker student in there. That can happen, but people don't like that because it makes them feel small. It makes them feel intellectually small, and they need to get the fuck over it
you
because
know, to that point,
kids back
to that point,
is fucking stupid. It's fucking stupid, man.
there
There's so
have
much ego.
there have been a number of stupid events that have all been publicized heavily in the media in the last, quarter or whatever we're in now. I guess we're in the second, we're entering the third quarter, whatever it is now, summer. In the last 3 months, there have been like innumerable acts of idiocy, and people die, and of course people cry about it, and they say, "Oh, they were so great," and all this dumb shit. Stupid behavior needs to be called out. When people are being dumb, they need to be called dumb. When they're doing stupid shit, somebody needs to say, "Quit doing that stupid shit." If they're doing dangerous shit, they need to be. Someone needs to fucking slap them upside the head and say, "Quit doing dangerous shit." Like, are we? It seems like we're at this place where nobody wants to remind people, "Hey, hey, bud, don't do that." It's like the internet's veil of anonymity has somehow people have somehow managed to extend it into the real world, where they think, oh, I can just do whatever the fuck I want. No one's gonna say shit because no one says anything about it. And I think maybe it's because most people don't have that kind of filter in their mind where when they see someone doing something completely dumb, they don't have the ability to regulate their brain enough to say, wait, this is a bad idea, I better say something. Or maybe it's worse, maybe the culture is so just acidic that if someone were even to suggest, hey man, maybe that's not a good idea, I mean, they get into fights. I don't know, I don't go out very often because I see a lot of idiots just driving around with their 4,000-pound automobile or heavier automobile, driving around like they don't know what the fuck they're doing, sitting in the middle of the road, just driving like a moron who thinks they have a tiny car. Because there are no tiny cars anymore, they're all huge. I think that the trend in academia that I've noticed is when someone says, well, let's just debate about it. And the academic says, no, because this isn't something that's up for debate. Go publish your research and we'll get it peer reviewed and then we'll see. But the average person isn't going to even know where to begin with something like that. Because debate me is the same thing as come at me, bro. But it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Like who wants to actually what person who has gone through the rigors of understanding the debate process, who actually wants to go through that process with somebody who hasn't demonstrated that they even understand where that begins?
And why should they?
Why should they? Why would they do that to
know?
themselves? Why?
Well, and this is one of those things I feel as if because not a lot of Americans have gone into higher education, their understanding of it is more like TV based, and TV presents undergrad is basically like high school. And you're like, what do you mean like high school? Well, you'll see shit like in community, people have like lockers. Like that's fucking crazy to think of a college campus where people are going to lockers in the hallways and shit. Like in the school hallway. Like I'm not talking about a gym room locker. Like, yeah, they always have those in the gym, but like lockers where people go, but and they have like bells. Imagine being in a college class and the bell rings. That shit don't happen.
Yeah, if a bell rings and you're in a college class, that means there's a fire in the building.
Right, yeah, yeah. That's the only time a fucking bell is ringing. Well, because I remember like when I first went to undergrad, when I first started undergrad, and like no bells would ring at the end of the course, and I'm like, oh shit, the professor's just going over, like, where's the bell? And then you're like, oh, this is college, there are no bells, and that's why professors frequently go over their time. But it's also like that's just how college is, but that's not how it is on television. So if you have this like completely disconnected high school reference understanding of what college is, then yeah, you can act like Joe Rogan and just be like, "Oh, debate me, bro," as if people in a classroom can just like do that shit to the professor. Like You get kicked out of a course if you disrupted a class, like, and didn't let the professor continue their lesson, and you were just like, no, debate me now. That's like the type of disruption that if you didn't leave, they could call the cops on you and like have you removed physically and shit like that. So I'm like, the idea that you can just go into a college course and just demand the fucking professor debate you on any given subject, that's not how shit works. Let alone after.
It's so preposterous when you put it like that. It's just it reminds me of the people who like to stand at the top of stairwells and who stand in the middle of hallways and in the middle of doorways. It's just like infuriating. You know
Well,
the
okay,
what's the
let me reframe that. I've challenged a professor before on something, and I can explain exactly what it was because the professor had to concede that I was right on this thing, but it was like, okay, so there's an effect. It's not the Doppler effect, but whenever um something is being filmed at, what was it? It's 24 frames per second or whatever. Okay, it
so
doesn't
you need
matter.
15 frames per second to animate, but you need
It
24
doesn't
frames per
actually matter.
second
It
for
doesn't actually
motion
matter
picture like
what
film.
frames are being filmed. If anything that's being filmed matches the frame rate of the camera, then it starts to rotate in the other direction. So
Oh, rolling shutter.
that effect, I was trying to explain, well, that can happen in real life too. And the professor's like, no, it can't. And I'm like, yes, it can, because I've seen it. And he's like, no, it can't. I'm like, I can reproduce the effect. And so we determined the reason it happens is if there's two frequencies of light hitting the same object, that a same object is rotating from sufficient enough different angles, then it can reproduce the effect without a camera. And the place you see it, and when I say this, you can be, oh shit, it's on a turntable.
Oh yeah.
So when you start the turntable, there's a period where everything's moving in the same direction on the platter, and at a certain point when it's getting up to speed, some of the dots will start to spin in the other direction. Well, it's because there's usually two
There's a
lights.
stroboscopic effect.
Right. And one of the lights is white and one of the lights is yellow. So they're at different frequencies. Well, that same effect will happen in physical real life then. And it's like, because I took a turntable in and demonstrated it to the class, he's like, oh, you're right. And we had this thing in terms of like, when he brought it up in class, it was him explaining it the first time. And when I'm like, no, I've seen it in real life. And he's like, no, no, that's not real. It became a point of contention where, because he doesn't want to lose face with his class, but also he's giving me the capacity to prove it, which is science. Then he's like, okay, I challenge you to bring it in and prove it. So that's this issue of like, you can do things like that when the timing is right in the proper venue. And there are times with the proper evidence, well, you can change the status quo and how they see things. But it's not just walking in off the street. It has to be like within the context of that lesson, within the context of a lab where you can raise questions because there's time. And it's like, because I was in his class and there was still more weeks left in that lesson, he had the capacity to respond and the capacity to have that exchange. Whereas if I did that on the last day of class before summer is about to hit and he's about to go off on his summer vacation, he has no fucking responsibility to even acknowledge me saying that. So that's where there's like certain times and certain places for things where you can raise questions against the status quo, and they'll take the question and examine it. And if the question was right or framed in a way that makes them have to re-examine things, then they'll re-examine it. But like I said, it has to be at the proper time and the proper place. Otherwise, it's like unrealistic to expect those people to stop and fucking pay attention. Like if I just like walked up to a professor in a hallway and I have a turntable on me, I'm like, hey, I want you to see this stereoscopic effect, strobe effect to prove it to you. And he's like, I'm on my way to fucking lunch. What are you trying to do right now? And I'm like, well, I really want you to like, you have to, you're a scientist. You have to fucking listen. No, he doesn't. He's on his way to lunch. So
Yeah.
like the idea that people are entitled to just like dictate when science has to engage with them, it's a weird, specifically American entitlement that comes from a lot of boys being only children and making that culture like
And
proliferate.
some of the best
Um,
photography experiences I've had involved setting up and waiting for hours for the sky to look right, for that cloud to move far enough, and hope that the sun didn't set so much that I lost all my light. And sometimes you have to come back the next day because it didn't happen. Sometimes it takes days and days, and then the weather changes and it's like not going to happen at all. That's like kind of how science is. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes the outcome is completely not what anyone hoped for. Sometimes it's exactly what everyone calculated, and then everyone gets to high five and be like, yeah, we did math. Our predictions were accurate. But demanding that science happen, like now, science happen now. That's like
but also, science is not people saying things as laws
Yeah.
and those things becoming laws because that person said so.
yeah,
And that's what like the Joe Rogans are trying to make it out to seem like.
that's religion.
Right. As if like the law of gravity exists because Isaac Newton declared it.
No, it was peer reviewed. His math was peer reviewed.
I mean, but even here's the thing.
His calculations
Even
for the
if he
mass of the moon were peer reviewed. Everything was peer
Even if he
reviewed.
had never said it and the math had never been peer reviewed, it would still exist.
That's true. He just figured out how to describe it with math.
Yeah.
The math
And this
works.
is the main difference between how science is discovered versus how it's presented to lay people in terms of like a scientist discovers things, they don't determine things. And that's like a huge distinction that it sounds pedantic, but it's like 1 plus 1 has always equaled 2.
Exceptionally
And
for AI.
like when we're talking about uh our like the math system that we use, it's like in the context of like meiosis and mitosis, um subtraction and addition are not the same. I feel like that's probably the closest to multiplication that exists in like nature. Um, but it's like the first person to declare 1 plus 1 didn't create that, they discovered it. And again, that's like when you have people who barely make it out of high school and don't get any sort of exposure to like let alone undergraduate level courses or undergraduate level teaching. It's very easy to think of a college course room as existing in the same way as like a high school course room where it's like, oh, you have to raise your hand to ask to go to the bathroom and shit like that. It's like, no, you're paying to be there. ask anybody. Like once I got to college, I didn't ask anybody for permission to go to the bathroom ever again because I was paying to be there. But you'll, you have that mindset of people think that it's just like, oh, you're the authority, the strict authority in a classroom down to like people having to ask you for permission to have their bodily functions execute.
That's high school
Like
study hall.
you right. I mean, that's what it was like, but people extend that experience to college in their minds. And that's why in their minds, information is about authority and not discovery. It's a huge misunderstanding of how information works because they've never been exposed to the places in which information is discovered. So they think information is created and not discovered. It's a huge disconnect. But again, this is where like because those people are never fostered in creativity, they think that creativity is like a rote one-to-one task anyway. So that's why they also don't value it. It's like, oh, you go in a room, write, and you have a book. There's no there's no struggle to them. They don't understand writer's block is like just a way that people make more content about writer's block to them. To them, it's like a concept that they think is a pretentious joke to writers because they've never gone up against a writer's block to understand what it actually is. And it's the same concept as a runner's wall. It's like some people who've never actually tried to run long distance have never hit a runner's wall to know what it's like in terms of like it's real. It's fucking totally real, but you have to actually go really far before you hit it. Otherwise, you'll never understand what it's like. And I think that's where there's this element of getting back to Dunning-Kruger in terms of like when you don't know what you don't know, the the entitled will fill in the gaps, and that can go wildly wrong and be wildly incongruous with real life when their extrapolations are not informed by reality. Um, okay, I'll give an example. So whenever the like 2017 crypto market hit, there was a lot of people that extrapolated incorrectly for various reasons, and they went in a certain direction with their extrapolations. And it's like the the most egregious is John McAfee, who's like, "Oh, Bitcoin's gonna be worth $100,000 before 2020." Yeah, okay. Good job, John. Good fucking guess, you fucking idiot. Not even close. But I don't know if that was his real extrapolation, then he was so far off that I have to think that in his mind, um his projection calculator was only working with like 10% reality. And that's where people who make projections, their projections are more accurate based on their ability to interpret reality accurately in their mental calculator when they're making those projections. So you look at somebody like Marshall McLuhan, well, his fucking mental calculator had like 97% accuracy in understanding the reality of the world around him when he was making his projections. Because if you go and look at it, well, he was fucking right about so much shit that you're like, yeah, clearly this dude understood the world around him in terms of what was happening and the trajectory in which it was moving and the likelihood it would continue on that trajectory. And it's like he's I always go to him because he's one of the most accurate um futurists who have made predictions that have come true. And then you look at somebody like Ray Kurzweil. Well, he's working with like 50% reality because some of the shit he's said has come absolutely true, and then some of it looks completely nonsensical now, whereas before it looked like Ray Kurzweil might be the next actual prophet, but it just happened to be related to tech. And but after a while, his singularity claims started to drift more and more into just the deification of technology. And I think a lot of people started to realize that, which is why you don't see Ray Kurzweil in the mainstream media hardly anymore.
Well,
Like I think he works at Google.
see, it's only got 6 more years for AI to pass the to surpass human intelligence and complete the Turing test, and then by 2045, humans will merge with artificial intelligence. In the phenomenon he refers to as singularity.
Well, they don't even use the Turing test anymore.
Okay.
It's the Loveless test now.
Ah, that's funny.
Biggest reasoning is because the Turing test is effectively just teaching lying.
Yeah.
So that's the reasoning behind moving away from the Turing test and moving towards the capacity to create, which is the Loveless test. So that started happening over a decade ago, as machine learning started to get better at creating things, and that was where like chatbots have been passing the Turing test with. Here's the problem: chatbots pass the Turing test with lay people,
Yeah.
and that's a huge problem. Which means lay people are not good at determining the difference between a bot and a real person. Not that bots are good enough, and that's where you get fucking dumbass dudes who get their life savings stolen by a chatbot who's asking like the right questions. I don't know if you've seen any uh of the like predatory chatbots, but they only exist because they work.
I don't know. I tend to call out robots when I encounter them. I encountered an actual voice robot that was very very convincing, and even said,
They've been around for years.
yeah, and they said, I said, I'm sorry, I don't have time to talk to a robot. And they said, oh, I'm very sorry. What can I say to you to convince you that I am real? And it was one of those moments where whoever wrote that script, or whoever was involved in softening consonants, did a very poor job. And so you get these vocables that are very sharp sounding. They're like edgy sounding, brittle sounding, and they don't have that kind of nuanced role that human voices typically have, even if they've smoked cigars and drank whiskey their entire lives.
So you reminded me of one that happened a couple years ago, and it persisted. Um, like I don't know if they ever busted the people, but this was before Chat GPT, and like it was not very complicated and complex. It was clearly like a script that was being read, and it could respond to like probably 5 or 6 different things that you would say. But the gist of it was that it was claiming to be representing not the police directly, but it was like families or moms or something that supported police, and they were supposedly collecting money for Indiana police. So that's when I think I like tipped off the FBI or some shit, because I'm like, you can't be pretending to be cops to fucking ask like ask people for money because a bunch of old people are gonna fall for it. And the only reason I even tipped off the FBI is because it was like very complex. Where if you said something, it would stop talking, and then it would like play a script like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, ma'am," or "I couldn't hear you, sir." So it would like do these things to make you think it was a real person that you were interacting with. But my ear, I could clearly hear the cuts between when it was playing audio or like constructing the
Trying to
words or
stitch it
whatever it was
together.
doing. It was trying to like stitch a response together while also listening.
Hmm.
And because I know how those things work, I could pick it up, but like somebody's grandma or grandpa wouldn't be able to notice that shit. So that's where I'm like, this is definitely going to get a bunch of people, which is why I think it went on for at least 6 months because I would get the calls every month, once or twice every month. But that's like one of the times where I'm like, I really need to fucking reach out to cybercrime because this is gonna affect too many fucking people if just left unchecked. Um, but that's like I said, that was years ago. So I know that there's if you're hitting getting AI things now, it's only because that shit's working.
Oh man, the next time I get an AI trying to talk to me, I'm just gonna start issuing, old school database queries that result in cleaning tables.
Yeah, and that's where I'm wondering like, so this is what's funny to me as somebody who has a degree in psychology and cybersecurity. Like the closer you get to natural language models, the attacks are going to start changing dramatically. So this is where you started to get like behavioral attacks where it's like if I can convince an AI to lie to me, then that AI is fucking poison. Period.
Yeah.
Once it can be convinced to lie, it's fucking done. It's fucking poison. So this is where I'm like, I'm not sure if all of these AI models are having behavioral like query behavior like let me see how to phrase this. Query behavior affecting resistant models where me asking questions should not change the behavior of the system at the core of how it functions. Whereas what they're calling hallucinations in terms of AI being willing to lie to people, that may be them rationalizing not understanding how to prevent the AI from taking that step. They've had so many scripts that prevent it from doing certain things. Like if you ask it to tell you how to make a bomb, it won't do it. So there's like they know how to prevent it from doing certain things. But this is again where their behavioral attacks or their behavioral attack resistance is going to have to evolve with natural language processing in a way that I'm not sure they're prepared. They may have enough understanding of the behavioral threat, but I'm not I'm not confident based on what I'm seeing. Um, and further, I don't know if you've seen the people who do the fake AI sites and then do the like responses to people as if like
Oh, wait, aren't
it's
those
an
just
actual.
like being farmed out from some coffee shop in India?
Well, when they're trying to farm data, but some people do them as jokes just to fuck with people. So there's all these. It would be like a reverse Turing test at this point to know if you're dealing with real AI or something pretending to be AI, because that's where it's like you have these lay people who can't tell the difference. Like when they're going, you can tell some of them who are encountering this fake AI think that the AI is just bad and they're like lamenting, oh, this fucking sucks. Well, it's not real. So these people can't tell the difference. So, like, that's why they're also going to be a poor judgment of knowing when AI is sentient because they can't tell if AI is somebody pretending to be AI or if it's real AI in the first place. Dude's Ben Palmer, who does the he's the one that does the jokes around it. Um, there may be more than him, but his shit's hilarious, and it's like you can tell in the way that the people are interacting with it that some of them don't care and they just are genuinely like amused by the interaction, but some of them get like very frustrated that the AI quote unquote is so bad in terms of like so so for example, it'll somebody will say like I want to see a sexy picture of Hillary Clinton, and he'll like just go Google an image of Hillary Clinton and return it. And then that person will say, like, oh, I want to see Hillary Clinton naked. And then he'll just go like Google another picture of Hillary Clinton and return it. It's obviously not a new picture. And then the person will continue to escalate. Like, I want to see Alexandria Ocasio Cortez naked. And then he'll Google a picture of her not naked and return it. And this person just continues to like try to get their weird political rocks off. And he keeps frustrating them, not returning any actual pornography. But it's like, this person is not the smartest, fucking clearly. And they just continue to like try to bash their head against this fucking AI that doesn't seem to understand their horny requests, but they just continue to do it. So it's like that person thinks that nobody's watching them, and they think that that AI is real to a certain degree enough to continue to keep interacting with it in a way where I'm like, the fact that that person exists, it doesn't surprise me that some Republicans out there trying to get AI to make some like weird Democrat porn. But like the fact that they actually are doing it and then in the process are doing it on an AI that is not even real, it's like we're really dealing with
We're dealing with
a
fiction.
yeah, this is like stranger than fiction. Like you couldn't, if somebody wrote that in like a Black Mirror episode, it'd be like, oh, this is fucking too unbelievable. Like you can't make this character, like that's too far fetched for anybody to actually be this extreme of a Republican and then go home and request AI to make horny fucking Hillary Clinton pictures. Like that person is too unbelievable in a like comedy writer's room. But no, they exist. That person is real. So that's where, to me, this technology being released on this particular population, it's like it wasn't the tech. If there's any semblance of like the world ending, it's not because AI. It's because some dude is a ravenous Republican, but he really just wants to see Hillary Clinton and AOC have sex. But he like couches that in like fucking vitriol. Like that's why society's about like if society's gonna die, it's because of that. Not because we have fucking 8 search queries going in parallel, making a really fast return on something that's basically scraped from the internet. Because it's not creating anything, it's just scraping from the internet and putting things together. So like, isn't, something gives the appearance of creation that's really just high speed plagiarism. Like, of course, some dude who just wants some like horny pictures is gonna be impressed by that. Whereas that dude, whatever the fuck his name is from Google, who keeps blowing these fucking stupid dog whistles about shit that's not like not the actual threat, to get people riled up about things that aren't actually threatening them.
I wonder if he's
That's
got a
when I'm
book
like,
out or something.
what's that?
I wonder if he's got like a book that he recently published or something like that.
I wouldn't doubt it. Yeah. What was his name again?
Jeffrey Hinton. Yeah, he left Google recently. And
This isn't even the one I was thinking of though, because the one I was thinking of is some dumpy looking dude, neck beard, with glasses, who had worked at Google at some point and was like, the machines were talking to each other.
oh,
So
that's
it
the
was,
that's the Lambda. That guy's got a weird name. It's like
yeah, that's the one.
um, Google engineer. Uh, yeah, Blake Limoni, Lim, Blake Lemony. Fuck, I can't say his name. Lemoine. Ouch.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah,
That's the one.
the
I
so
guess he doesn't have
there's
glasses.
two ex Google AI engineers who are trying to make some money on their book tour, and this is probably how they're doing it.
Yeah, he got let go after violating the company's confidentiality agreement.
Oh, he doesn't like their large language model. It probably told him off. Well, that's interesting. There's not. That's not. There was one person they let go. Margaret Mitchell. That was the lead on Google's ethical AI team, and they fired them in 2021.
Oh, and Timnit Gibru or Gibru, I don't know how you say it, left.
Yeah,
She was I think, the head of ethics at the AI after that one.
yeah. They didn't have any problems with it up until a point, and then they have a problem. That's at least that's what it seems like with. God, I can't remember. I can't even say his name. Lemoyne. What's
Yeah,
interesting is that this guy was willing to just ruin his career instead
this
of.
fucking idiot said that the thing has a soul. Like, we haven't even proven humans have souls yet, bro. Like, how can you say that this, like, I'd like to believe we have a soul, but there's no fucking scientific evidence. So for him to be like, AI is sentient and it has a soul, man, shut the fuck up. Shut the fuck up. Nobody should be listening to anything that dude says at all. That's what I'm like, again, I'd love to believe that we have souls, but there's literally no fucking scientific remote evidence that a soul exists within human beings, let alone a goddamn fucking computer. So again, this is where people just start to overstep and over. I have a fucking, a degree in psychology. I don't think that dude does. Because if he did, he wouldn't be saying that fucking dumb shit in the first place. So that's where I'm like, yeah, you can have a degree in computer science and still say some fucking really dumb shit about computers because you don't know shit about the human brain. And just because computers are modeled after the human brain doesn't mean it's a corollary, let alone that people actually understand the fucking human brain yet.
The idea that a
Because they
computer
don't.
is an
They
analog of a
don't.
human brain is just kind of ludicrous. There's
And
but
even if it was a perfect analog, science still does not understand the fucking human brain. So it's like this notion of overstepping way beyond the bounds of like what's possible in terms of there are things that are reproducible, but they don't know necessarily why. So, for example, they can take somebody's dreams and accurately take videos and reconstruct those dreams from video based on the brainwave patterns compared to what those images would look like if a person was seeing or experiencing them. That's pretty fucking amazing. But that doesn't mean they understand what dreams are, let alone what is happening in the dream. And to like, nobody who's working on those things would take that step. They would not come to any conclusions about the root cause. They would only be able to come to conclusions about what they can see, aka the conclusions of those results. So that's where, to me, like, having worked in a fucking lab, looked at people's brains, I know the things that, like, if you can look inside a person's brain, there's so many conclusions you can draw, and there's so many things that you can't even remotely fucking come to the conclusion by looking at their brain waves, even if you can match images to their brain waves, because you don't have certain context to establish what those things mean. Even if you could fucking interview that person to get the proper context, that doesn't guarantee that even is the 100% explanation of what happened. So knowing that someone in the position to look at those things would not go beyond the bounds of what they can see slash what is there to make any assertions. When I see somebody talking about a soul as if they're trying to be in a serious conversation, that to me is like a red flag, because my thing is like, deep down inside, I hope, I sincerely hope that a soul exists. But as a scientist, if I was to ever discuss that concept in the context of someone who I wanted to take my opinion seriously, you better believe I'm not gonna discuss my hope of the human soul existing. I'm going to discuss the lack of evidence that we currently are faced with compared to all of the attempts. Well, it's also really difficult to observe that thing scientifically, but all of the attempts to observe a soul, quote unquote, have been unsuccessful so far. So why, if I'm looking at something scientifically, why would I ignore that instead of, or in light of my hope, if I'm trying to be presented seriously as a scientist? Which is why when I see these people like going to these extremes and talking about like benevolence and malevolence, or like souls or things like that, it's like, oh, you may be like super experienced with neural nets and computers, but you have no concept of how neural nets work in humans. That's a fucking dangerous place to be if that person's willing to start extrapolating publicly, and in a way, in a place like, I know that because of my expertise in certain things, I can't say things in certain venues without my words then being taken out of context and bastardized. So I would never say things in those venues. Like, it's a matter of like knowing how spin works, knowing how information and attention work. It's not an apolitical landscape, and it's not an a capitalistic landscape. So you have to always look at the context of information between, or within the context of politics and within the context of capitalist exploitation, to determine how to approach that information. Even down to like, when you look at YouTube, everything on YouTube is an advertisement. It's not information that's trying to enlighten you for the sake of enlightenment. It's trying to sell something to you, and hopefully entertain you in the process. A lot of people look to YouTube for entertainment or for information as if it's not trying to abuse their
Infotainment marketing funnel.
right. They're using YouTube as if it's a university, a nonprofit university, when it's 1,000% for-profit infotainment venue that does not guarantee that the information within it is true. So those things being the state of affairs in terms of like how people want to acquire information, there has been an anti reading campaign. I don't know when it started or where it started, but within America, there's a very deep rooted anti reading campaign that also tries to make it seem as if information is accessible in any form at any time. Like anything that can be in a book, you can find it on YouTube, and somebody will like you don't have to read the book. Somebody will just tell you that information. Obviously, that's not the way reality works. And I'm not saying that information within books has any more integrity than information not being presented in books. But there are certain books that have been peer reviewed and are being used to teach because they have been examined and they have had the contents of those materials looked at by specialists. And the information within those books is guaranteed to have a certain degree of accuracy that you do not get in a guarantee from YouTube. So like to me, that distinction is where when somebody doesn't understand why people teach from Shakespeare, then they're going to look at Shakespeare as not really having a real meaning within the context of the evolution of the English language. But if the person teaching that gives them the proper understanding and the proper context, that's not something that you can get understanding from by just reading Shakespeare. You need a historical framing. You need a before and after Shakespeare understanding of the English language. Not that he's the only one, but again, there's these things about information that is not really taught well in the American school system, and it turns people off from seeking out and acquiring information on their own. And in the process, they look to information aggregators or curators instead of becoming their own curator. So, like Joe Rogan, for example. And I don't know if people think of him as an information curator because he produces content, but what he's really become is a uh, a drip feed for surface level information that makes people feel as if they're taking a deep dive on the subject when in reality they only have time to touch the surface. Like you're not going to learn everything about any given subject in the course of a fucking podcast, but it'll make you feel like you did. It sure will try. And in the like you have the like Lex Friedman type podcast. Like there's absolutely nothing wrong with long form trying to get deep on subjects. But the thing that is bad about them is that they are the appearance of depth because it's also one-sided. Like the people on the podcast may be going deep, but it's because they have that depth within them from their studies or their work or whatever they did for hundreds and maybe thousands of hours to be able to talk and present something that's condensed down to that 3 hours that feels like a deep dive, but is really just a drip condensation or a drip condensed of their experience that, like I said, it appears to be engaging at the same level of depth as it took them to get there when it's just a glimpse at that depth. And I think that's why, again, it's like when I see an expert talking about something and I listen to them, that does not equate with me understanding the thing that they're discussing at the same level of that expert. Podcasts make you feel like you get there in the course of that discussion because you'll have epiphanies and you'll have new neural connections that get made, and in the process that feels you're learning something, not you, but people are learning something, and it feels like your brain is growing because there are being new connections being made, but it's not to the same depth or to the same capacity as the expert that's presenting the information to make those new connections. And I've seen so many people go through those epiphanies and like learning experiences that they're getting from podcasts that they didn't get in classrooms. And I think that's why it's more appealing in a way that makes them more inclined to try to learn from these, like this form of media. Not to say that you can't learn from podcasts, because you totally can. But again, this is where the anti-reading campaign in America has culminated in the talk radio podcast university. We have a bunch of people who just listen to, I don't know who the right wingers are now. Glenn Beck. I don't know. They listen to those fucks for like 3 hours a day. Just nonsense, 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 repeated over and over and over.
Ben
And
Shapiro.
bench, yeah,
The
that fuck.
Verdict with Ted Cruz. I mean, I shouldn't even say these things aloud. I feel like I'm gonna like start my tongue will start burning off or something. No, there's a lot of them. I'm serious. There's like a list. There's like 29 conservative podcasts on Podchaser. These are all getting plenty of views. They're all big. Man. So it's not hard to find an entire. Candace Owens has her own show. Wonderful. Fuck. That's the thing. Like there's no shortage of conservative media. There's no conservative any kind of media. There's too much media to be consumed. I bet if we just do like a cursory search on YouTube for anything and look for the thing with the lowest amount of views, we're going to end up with a gigantic list. But we see the exceptions that have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of views. We see those things first because that's the algorithm wants us all dialed into, the thing that they decide is most interesting to us. But there's no shortage of media.
Well, and it's funny, the way you frame it, it's like the way the algorithm presents information to us is how conservatives think information in academia works. And it couldn't be further from like I think in that framing, I think that's like hitting on why these people there's reasons you shouldn't trust authority or trust like academia without question. Like even people in academia don't trust it without question. It's not because there are top-down mandates though. And it's that disconnect with how information operates in academia versus how they see information operating in their Twitter or Facebook feeds or whatever, or like news headlines. Um, it's like I think Republicans think that a dean of a university is like the equivalent of a Rupert Murdoch or something. And that like, oh, dean says you have to use people's pronouns and or add like a thing for pronouns in your every form on your website that is for your courses now or some or like little as if the dean of a college is like dictating how the professors in the classrooms operate.
This is how you shall teach.
Right, on like a very fascistic level of like this is the mandate for this school year and these are the things that are changing.
Do not use these words.
Right.
Use these words instead.
Which even within colleges at a university, it's like barely like that. Like not even like there's certain like if there's a withdrawal by date or something like that, I want to say that may be about the only damn near the only thing that they like mandate across all courses within a college. Like there's maybe like upper course limits or something, and even then you can potentially request to have more people enroll or like it's just every classroom is different to a certain degree, so there's not really like you can't really have that kind of standardization on like a college campus.
Well, I think that that idea only works if one actually believes that all course pedagogy is like homogenous.
Oh God, yeah, and even there's not homogenous pedagogy within fields. You know what I mean? So like the idea of a homogenous pedagogy across an entire university, that's like I I can't even like wrap my brain around what that even look like.
I
You
know,
know,
I'm crying
like
now. It's just it's so silly to me. It's not cheese.
well,
It's not a batch of light beer. Like,
what made me really realize this is when there was like this movement towards quote unquote decentralized science, and I'm like, but isn't
uh,
it already
yeah, it's
decentralized?
already decentralized.
Yeah, and that's where like once I saw the quote unquote tech bro disruptors trying to decentralize science, then I was like, oh shit, none of these motherfuckers have ever done science because it's way decentralized and that's why it works. Like that's the only reason science actually works the way it does because effectively the process of observing and reproducing hypothesis and outcome is like meant to be reproducible. So like you have to give your methodology up. Can't copyright your methodology if you want if you want to do science. And that's where I'm like
Also,
it
science has a series of filters that exist to ensure that the people participating in experiments are qualified to participate in those experiments. You
and
can't just walk in off the street and expect to be taken seriously at CERN.
that's one of the biggest benefits, but also they have filters in place so humans don't get unethically tested. Like human ethics or human subjects testing is subject to so much rigorous ethics examination. That's why like most peer reviewed tests don't get they don't get accepted to do their experiment on the first try usually because not that anybody is like overlooking ethics. It's just damn near impossible to get all of the ethical insight as a person who's doing research it's like damn near impossible to understand all of the ethical implications in one's own research because you're too close to it, or a person's too close to their own research, so they can't see all of the potential negative angles of how it could benefit a human, because presumably the entire reason they're looking at that research is because they saw that there would possibly be some benefit. So a person doing experimental research isn't inclined to look for negative things that are going to hurt humanity or hurt their field. They're inclined to do research that's going to benefit their field and benefit humanity. So that's where it's like they're not thinking of all of the negative ethical impacts because they're looking at it in good faith. So that's when an ethical assessment is not like, oh, you're a bad faith actor. It's like these things were overlooked. Now you have the chance to change them, resubmit, and then get approval to make sure that you're not violating any ethical codes. So, like, things like that being in place are there because when they didn't have those in place, they would do experiments like taking a person and putting them in front of a button and telling them every time they press that button that it would increase the electric shock on somebody and that maybe that person was going to die, but you have to follow instructions, so continue to push that button no matter what happens. And so experiments like that were being performed and making people go through fucking horrible traumas, or the Stanford prison experiment in terms of like making one population guards and making one population prisoners, and let's see what fucking happens. Well, that's unethical as fuck. So they stopped doing shit like that once they started putting ethical guards in place to make sure that the science was not harming people or animals unnecessarily, for that matter. So it's like, if you don't understand those things, then it's real easy to think that anything goes in like a research laboratory, whereas like in reality those are some of the most rigorously held to standard places in America, if they are in fact getting research funds. Like there's definitely like illicit and illegal research that happens, but not with like public funding. No, 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 that's not going to happen because would a university would be so irreparably harmed if something like that was going down at their university. The university is going to make sure to keep that shit in check before an outside authority is even going to have to be called in. So that's where like they're not going to get human ethics violations for the sake of like, oh, this really cutting edge discovery, like, oh, if I'm just gonna turn my head on this. Like there's a lot of movies where you see the scientist within a publicly funded laboratory making those kind of decisions. Yeah, that's never gonna fucking happen in real life. Never. Absolutely fucking never. That person would be too worried about their own reputation. The university would be worried about their reputation. And if anybody started to even remotely drift into that shit, if they had tenure, they would just be removed. They'd be like, nope, you can't come back. We're going to keep paying you because you got tenure, but sorry, you can't do this anymore because it's putting the university at risk. So there's all these things in terms of like, yeah, tenure protects professors from unjust removal. And yeah, there's abuses of tenure, but a university is going to protect itself from being shut down before
Yeah.
they allow someone as an individual to violate any sort of code that could then cause harm on the rest of the university. That's the way things are now. It's not the way it always was, but because so many people have violated human rights, that's why we're where we are now in terms of the standards and practices that are in place on campuses in academia to prevent those types of abuses. Not to say that they're perfect or that other abuses don't happen, but there's certain abuses are that are 1,000% checked and balanced to make sure that the data that comes out of the institutions is valid and usable, because if it's found to be like, if a discovery is made under unethical standards, it's not going to be accepted by the scientific community anymore. So it's like that person would get shunned and get excommunicated from their field if they were found to be doing some unethical shit. Now, but 100 years ago, that's not true. So it's like, if you don't have that context of academia, then it's going to be really easy to confuse the academia that's presented in Indiana Jones with real life. Because to a certain degree, that Indiana Jones fucking Raiders of the Lost Ark, uh, Temple of Doom type academia approach is not, that's not too far from reality. It's like not necessarily going to be the same person who's like going into the field and stealing artifacts as the person who's then in the classroom presenting the stolen artifacts. But that's not far off from how colonialist academia operated, in terms of like, yeah, we're going to go loot a bunch of fucking artifacts from some place where we don't belong and then go teach about them in academia as if nothing unethical happened.
These
Like,
wood
yeah, they used to do that
carvings
shit
were
all the
taken
fucking time, of course.
from a sample of. And that's every so often I read about some government filing for the return of their stolen property for like to some museum in England, and it just makes me kind of smile. It's like, man, you guys stick it to them because no one else is doing it.
Well, but this is like, at one point in time, they were doing LSD experiments at Harvard. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, it's really difficult to fathom what that would be like in terms of a country that is in a place where what is in common parlance referred to as the highest institution of education in this nation, not accurately, but in the common understanding, if that place is doing research on LSD, like, that is a very different landscape in terms of their understanding of ethics. So like that, what is it, like 70 years ago now? That's not that long ago, but to have come to the point where our generation looks at those tests as inhumane. It's like less than a century ago, the things that were being done within science and within academia, the current science sees as barbaric and completely inhumane. So I think in terms of like the layperson who doesn't understand that viewpoint would very easily be swallowed in the notion that science is still operating in the like late 1800s, early 1900s mindset of, if it's a breakthrough, it doesn't matter if it was ethically discovered or not. Like, no, 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 no. That's not science anymore. That's like fringe.
Hey,
That's
you know what?
that's Stockton Rush.
The
Stockton Rush
ocean
was not a scientist.
the ocean made a breakthrough, and now we know not to use a titanium filament carbon fiber loom to build
Oh,
submersibles.
oh my God. Yeah.
So
So that's a perfect example to me of the difference between science and delusional, self-indulgent attempts at innovation that are actually shots in the dark. And that's where I can see it, but I think now a lot of regular people are going to start to be able to see it. And this is where, like, before, if somebody was like a tech bro bullshitter, you'd bring in somebody like me to be like, is this guy a tech bro bullshitter or not? And like the layperson, if they're like working in an office and they're like, oh, I got my degree in HR or human resources or whatever. I have no idea about this tech. I need to bring in an expert to know if this other quote unquote appearing to be expert is telling the truth or not. And then it becomes an expert off, and the most convincing expert wins in the minds of the layperson. We're moving past that, partially because the Zoomers have the information access, so it's way more difficult to bullshit them. And that's like what boomers fucking hate, man. That not to like just, and I'm not harping on boomers, it's more so they hate the fact that anybody has information access, because then they can't bullshit. And boomers are the most bullshitting fucking generation ever. Like they're the fake it, they're the ones that came up with fake it till you make it. Literally, because their grandparents didn't have the option, or their parents, I mean, like the boomer, quote unquote, greatest generation, they only either had the option to work or go to war. There's no like, oh, I'm gonna fake my way up this corporate ladder. That shit wasn't an option. So like our boomer parent generation, they came up with that fake it shit. So like to me, it's funny seeing their attitude towards information come home to roost, in terms of like, because they thought their parents were authorities just because they were older and didn't understand the information hierarchy has authority because of meritocracy when it exists as an information hierarchy, not just because of fascist down like downtrodden. Then one can operate and understand how to like disseminate information without doing it in a way that depends upon being fascistic, and then in the process giving people access to information without the fear that they're going to use that information in any negative way, because you've trained them to not do that. Whereas boomers don't trust their kids or their grandkids to use information, because boomers were douchebags and they treated their kids and their grandkids like shit, and they don't want their kids and their grandkids to understand that that's not the only way. And once, like, for example, like I'll use this example because it's my family and I can see the difference in terms of like how other people exist. Like my grandfather never once told my father in his life, I love you. I don't think my grandma did either. That's the way that generation operated. Like they did not have the luxury and potentially the capacity to be emotionally vulnerable. I don't, you can't blame them. Like my grandfather had to grow up in segregated Mississippi. So I'm not expecting him to be like crying in movies or some shit like that, because that motherfucker had to worry about getting lynched for the first half of his life pretty much constantly. So he's not operating of the mindset where you can like let your guard down. So he's never going to be like, oh, son, I love you. Because in his mindset, he might have to like fight the KKK at any given moment, even to the point where he's like fucking 60 years old. So he can't turn that off because he's conditioned growing up in that mindset. So I'm not going to blame him for that. If my dad was emotionally unavailable, I would have sure as fuck blamed him because he didn't have the same problems. So for him not being like he's not completely vulnerable in like, you know, he hasn't gotten rid of all his toxic masculinity, but he's recognized what my grandfather faced, what my grandfather fought against for, so he didn't have to face those things. And in the process, he made himself slightly more emotionally vulnerable because he had that luxury. Whereas a lot of people don't actually take that luxury and move that bar, and then try to condemn the men who move that bar as if they weren't being given a luxury to enjoy more emotions. Like my grandfather didn't get to enjoy a lot of emotions. Like sadness is something to be enjoyed when you have the capability of understanding that is not permanent. So in terms of like I don't know if it has desires, but it can't feel sadness. It can't feel joy, which is why it has effectively no desire. If you can't feel pain or joy, you're you don't have the capacity to want. And that's where I mean in terms of like breaking down those things as to why AI isn't malevolent or benevolent. It doesn't have desire. It doesn't have the capacity to want to hurt or to want to help. It's only capable of doing those things based on the code as input. AI can 1,000% harm. It can 1,000% help, but it has no capacity to desire to do either one of those things. So to speak as if it does means you don't understand AI. Not you, but one. So that's why I'm saying we're at this point. I can not look down upon my grandfather because I can understand that he was not given the capacity to develop the range of emotions that I have been given the luxury to do. So I can't hold him against, I can't hold that against him because I've been given the proper context as to why. On the other hand, you have people who then experience those things and don't give that person any empathy. Like now that I think about it, I don't know if my grandfather ever said I love you to me either, but it's not because he didn't love me. It's because he never learned how to express emotion in the same way that I did. So why would I like hold that against him if I know his plight? And to me, there's a lot of people who know the plight that those people have gone through, but then don't want to extend that same empathy that they're asking for. And that's where I'm like, it doesn't mean you have to accept their negative behaviors, but if you can at least start like taking steps to understand why they are the way they are, then there's never going to be any progress made from either side. And that's kind of like I wouldn't look at my grandfather as necessarily like right. He's definitely not like right wing. Like he would never be like a Trump supporter or anything like that. But there's like certain things in terms of like the Southern Black experience that people would see and be like, oh, he's a conservative. It's like that's a oversimplified way of approaching it. Um, but at the same time, it's like, well, you'd have to understand the context of them being alive in a time where they had to flee segregation. So it's like that person who fled segregation is not about to support the right wingers who are pro segregation. It's just not like it's not rational. So it's like disingenuous for people who frame emotionally caged Black people as conservative as if they are not restrained from being able to have these emotional freedoms that other Black people are given, like or have earned through fighting the system and then given to their subsequent generations as a gift. And in terms of like, it's very, I'm in a place of luxury to be talking about being able to like tell someone I love you because I was raised in an environment that allowed me to grow emotionally. But it would be disingenuous and hypocritical of me to look at somebody who doesn't have that capacity and not try to understand why they are not in like why they haven't been able to grow in that same way. And that's where I think a lot of the emotionally stunted people aren't in a place of like not wanting to grow. They just haven't really had a sufficient opportunity. And it's hard to know which one we're dealing with.
That's some heavy shit, man.
Well, I mean,
No, I'm serious. That was really interesting because I don't think like it's like I was saying earlier. Sometimes it seems like the veil of anonymity of the internet has been extended into or people have been trying to bring it into the real world, and I think that that's the kind of thing that happens on the internet. People they don't make an attempt to understand. There is no expression of empathy on the internet because without a meme or without some long-winded anecdote, it's the internet's a cold place. And I think that culture of the internet has influenced the larger culture around us in a sense because no one takes the time to understand what's going on. Just react, react, react.
well, and it's like
Like
I'm
I
not
pulled
trying
I
to
pulled
say,
a kid out of the middle of the road the other day. They were stuck at the intersection on 37 and Victor Pike, and I pulled up next to him, and I blocked traffic kind of. But it could have gone around. There's plenty of room to go around me, and I asked the kid if he's like, "Is anyone coming?" And he said no. So I strapped him to my truck and I pulled him across the road. But some douchebag is like stops the whole line and says, "Thanks for blocking traffic." Meanwhile, I'm trying to get this kid out of the road. And I get him across the road, and a trooper bleeps the horn like, "Hey, pull over!" And so I pull over at a gas station, and I unhook from the guy's car, and the trooper just wanted to make sure the guy wasn't like on drugs, and they left. The guy thanked me, and I went home. But nobody was gonna stop for that kid because it was that time of day when everyone's rushing to go someplace really, really hard. There's an entire line backed up at the light because it's that time of day. But I didn't have time to figure out what actually happened. I just wanted to know, is anyone coming? Because if no one's coming, then I'm gonna get this dude out of the road.
man, I hate people in a rush. Like
Yeah.
I was leaving. I promise this is like positive, but I was leaving Target the other day, and I happened to get stuck behind these like old people. They must have been 80, 85, and they were going slow as fucking shit, like the slowest a human could possibly move. And I'm just like, okay, whatever. And then the old lady turns around and notices me, and she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And I'm like, "Man, that sucks. That sucks that like too many people have made this person feel like even in being as old as they are that they have to rush somewhere." And I told her, I'm like, I'm not in any rush. I hate people that rush, but it's like the fact that we had that exchange, it's like, man, people just need to slow the fuck down and like exist and not be in a rush to get somewhere else. Cause it's like I felt so bad for that lady that she felt the need to apologize. Cause I'm like, clearly, even as slow as she's moving, she has not shaken that feeling of pressure that other people have put on her of like, you need to fucking hurry up. And that's where I'm like, unless somebody's like dying and somebody needs to get rushed to the hospital, or like we're talking about the president and needs to get somewhere, that feeling is unnecessary. That like trying to rush people out of your way, that shit is like the worst thing to put on another human being in terms of like them not feeling important enough that they need to get out of somebody's way. And that's where I'm like, I think if people could just slow the fuck down and let everybody move at their own pace, that's like a lot of the tension, and it would just be gone.
Yeah. I agree 100%.
Exceptional radio. Exceptional Randos shows produced live in Sunroom Studios' Bass Capsule.
Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random. Exceptional Radio.